Hi everyone, welcome to another video. There's lots of amazing things happening in the world right now, but before we get into them in coming videos, I wanted to touch base on the restrictions post-convoy and get a sense of how well they've impacted the restrictions, if they've actually been lifted like they said they would, and to just sort of get a sense of what's going on in this area. So I want to go through a few provinces by way of example to get a sense of what's going on with these restrictions. So a lot of the criticism towards the convoy was that restrictions were already started and that they were going to be removed in any case, and that the convoy was not necessary. It was the fifth wave, it was the Omicron fifth wave, and the restrictions were starting to be lifted and the plans were being talked about. Anyway, but personally, that's not my opinion. I think that the protests have actually pushed a lot of the restrictions to be lifted earlier, and a lot of provinces did respond with urgency. But the issue is the depth and breadth of the restrictions, if they are actually faithful to the requests of the convoy and the protest or not. And my answer is, after going through a few of the list of the restrictions, is that it's not, and it was clear to me that they were going to just play it with the differences across provinces, with the provincial versus the federal regulations, and also give a lot of leeway for businesses to do whatever they like so that they can, so that they can still implement a lot of the vax passes and things like that. So starting here with Alberta, on January 12th, Alberta was struggling and flooded. The hospitals were flooded from the Omicron fifth wave of COVID. Keep in mind that the protests started around January 22nd, or the convoy started on January 22nd. And so this is about 10 days before then. So a few statistics here: the hospitalization increased by about 60% between Jan 4 and 11. So the usual drama, if you want to call it, of all of the cases going on. So moving to February 3rd, the COVID fifth wave supposedly peaked in Alberta, and this was good news because it goes downward from here. And then by February 15, the province is on track to zero restrictions. So by then, the convoy was well underway, and Alberta, along with Saskatchewan, were well on their way to remove the restrictions. They are among the provinces that responded the most quickly to the asks. But here we are on February 26th, and Alberta will move to step 2 of its plan to ease restrictions on March 1. So Alberta has a 3-step plan. So to me, this looks like a slower paced progress than what we would have initially expected from Kenney's very urgent and caring response to the convoy, like we saw in a few videos. And so step 2 will see the removal of many long-standing public health measures, most masking, indoor, outdoor social gathering, etc. Through these articles, we don't see anything about employment requirements, employers' requirements for the vaccine, and the federal transport as well is not addressed in any of these. These are provincial restrictions, and that is one of the tricky things that you can imagine the government will use to keep pushing the vaccination goals. In here, with step 2, isolation and quarantine requirements will remain in place. And then on February 8th, the 3 steps to lift COVID restrictions, starting with removing the restrictions exemption programs and masking at school. And the timeline for step 3 is still to be determined. So here we go. This is the kind of push-pull narrative that we've been seeing through the media, where they make you feel, or they made us feel, like they were going to remove the restrictions during the convoy, like Jason Kenney went on TV and all of that. And actually, they weren't. They're just, they're just going through their regular timeline and pulling back on what seemed to be a commitment to remove the restrictions. So not buying it. I think this is pretty telling of the fact that they're not really serious. And all of this nice talk that Kenney and others have given during the convoy is, in my opinion, just a bunch of sedatives. Looking at the government website, the provincial government website of Alberta, we have here the details of the steps. So step 2 is what we're getting into on March 1st. And then it says remaining school requirements removed, for example, kindergarten to grade 6 cohorting, screening activities removed, capacity limits lifted, indoor, outdoor gathering limits lifted, mandatory work from home, etc. I consider these almost cosmetic kind of requirements. They're not really the core issues that people were asking for. The core issues are vaccine mandates, having to take the vaccine in order to work, in order to do any number of things. Let's look at step 3. Determine and will depend on hospitalization rates continuing. So again, here, this like non-committal kind of wording that doesn't really tell us what is going to really happen. So I don't think this is a commitment to removing the requirements. I think this is just sedative kind of talk. And again, mandatory vaccines are not mentioned in here. Let's see if they're anywhere below. Not seeing it. Let's move on to BC. So BC was one of those provinces that said that they weren't gonna, yield to the requests of the convoy. And they followed something similar. So here, just backing up to, this is January 18. Again, keep in mind the convoy started just a few days later. And they were already opening up. So you can see here, British Columbia will allow gyms to open from Thursday, etc. Starting to lift restrictions slowly. As of February 15, so this was well into the convoy, BC says it will lift most COVID restrictions as long as masks and vaccine cards are used. So BC stood out as one of those provinces that wasn't going to yield to the convoy. And to me, yes, lifting these restrictions make life easier, but it doesn't get to the heart and the core of the issues that the protesters had with this COVID project, if we want to call it. On top of that, BC brought a vaccine mandate to all remaining healthcare worker, and this was by February 9th, and that too was well within the protest. So that didn't make a difference. And again, these are the kinds of mandates that we're concerned about. These are the kinds of mandates that we really want lifted, right? The idea of not having to put that thing in your body, that was the goal of the protest. So BC not yielding and pursuing these mandates. And looking at the BC government website, provincial government website, there is a proof of vaccination that remains posted on here. And it says proof of vax is required for some travel and access to some events. Continuing to follow restrictions for certain situations and travel requirements. If you're traveling within or leaving the country, show proof of vaccination. So this is also part of the federal mandate that was not lifted or is not lifted yet. And so the convoy did not impact this positively. Let's move on to a couple more provinces. Moving on to Manitoba. As of February 11, Manitoba said it was going to drop all the vaccine requirements. Manitoba was another one of those provinces that made a forceful announcement of dropping restrictions. And they also have a March 1 timeline, said the requirement of vaccine cards will be eliminated on Tuesday, March 1. Yes, this is progress. Certainly vaccine cards are an annoying restriction. But again, this is not the same as saying that certain jobs don't need a vaccine mandate or that employers cannot ask their employees to be vaccinated. So it doesn't address, these restriction lifting do not address these kinds of requirements. And capacity limits, okay, all good, but I think really compared to the core vaccine mandate, I think these are cosmetic restrictions. And now this is February 25th, and we're seeing these kinds of headlines pop up across different provinces where employers are keeping health mandates in place despite the rules loosening because supposedly businesses want to keep them because that is their preference and they are free to do so. So we're going to see this pop around, and it's just going to create this kind of environment where it's not all open or it's not all back to normal pre-COVID. And as expected, the Manitoba's immunization verifier app is going to remain available after proof of vaccination rules are lifted. So, this is a clear giveaway. Why would the verifier app be available after proof of vaccination rules are lifted? Because they might come back into play again. Businesses will still be able to continue to check for vaccine status. Again, giving leeway to businesses to basically do what they like with the COVID restrictions. And that, I think, will continue to create a divide between people. So this is on the Manitoba government website, and there is a proof of vaccination guidelines that remains posted in here. It says proof of vaccination required for 12 or older to attend certain businesses and events. There's no indication here that this is going to be lifted. I don't know if this is a delay on their part to update it or not, but honestly, I think that they're not really committed to removing these core restrictions. They're lifting the lighter restrictions, but again, the core vaccine mandate, I'm not really seeing has been addressed. And finally, stopping by Ontario, we have a similar thing going on here. This is the Ontario government website. Again, indoor social gatherings up to 100, so going from 50 to 100 on effect as of February 17. And so again, these are like small steps, towards lifting the restrictions. It seems to just be aligned with what their initial plan was. Doug Ford came up on TV a few times, just like Kenny, wanting to respond to the convoy in an indirect way. Of course, the whole narrative never gave credit to the convoy. That was clearly part of their strategy, but it seemed like they were answering to the urgency of it all, and they made us feel like they were going to lift the restrictions. But actually, when you look at the details and you look at their timeline and more carefully, you see that actually it's these were sedatives, and it's not really a true lifting of the restrictions. And again, the core mandate of having to be vaccinated for certain jobs, for certain environments is not lifted, and in all cases it hasn't been addressed thoroughly. So they won't come out and say, no, we're not removing the mandates for this or that job. They're not going to open that door. They're just going to word it differently to sedate the convoy protesters and others who want to see this lifted. So same deal. We do have a reassuring note from our friend, Dr. Uni, says we could have a really quiet summer when it comes to COVID. Of course, we're not sure about the fall. Of course, he has to throw in there, if we just would now throw away our masks and pretend the pandemic would never be over, that's actually not the case. But we should have, he says, if we're a bit lucky, a really good spring, summer, and early autumn, and then probably it will kick in again with seasonality. So let's not pretend they're not telling us. They're telling us. It is in the news. It's in many places in the news. It's not only Dr. Uni who's saying that in Ontario, it's other doctors across different provinces. Just throwing in here an interesting note from the mainstream media, the Freedom Convoy will be just a brief footnote in the histories of Canada's pandemic struggle. We've seen this narrative always downplaying, the alternative narrative, although I'm not so sure how alternative the convoy is. If you've seen my first video, I put around it a lot of question marks. And just a last note on Saskatchewan ending vaccine mandates for tens of thousands of public servants. Saskatchewan has been the most vocal against keeping restrictions, and they've made some of the strongest statements about removing them. But overall, I am seeing that there's a lot of slow-moving action, and it's not what they had promised. A key issue is that federally regulated workplaces need to have their employees vaccinated. This was the one that was issued on December 7, 2021, and it hasn't changed since. This is a big deal. There are approximately 18,500 employers in federally regulated industries, and they employ almost 1 million people, about 6% of all employees. Now, the thing about this is that it doesn't stop at these employers, but what happens is that there are spillover effects. So these companies within these industries who work in the marketplace, they have subcontractors and they work with other people in the marketplace. And what they've been doing is they've been asking these smaller companies, these smaller players, to also have their employees vaccinated, or else they won't do business with them. I've heard of this happen on the ground. So this has actually spillover effect, and this has not been removed. Finally, the mandatory vaccination to board, this was another big issue, and also this has not been revoked or repealed. In order to travel within Canada, outside of Canada, crossing the borders in this sense, it requires a vaccination and a proof of that in order to board. So in my opinion, the two biggest pieces of the federally regulated industries and the transport requirement, boarding flights and trains in Canada, this requirement, they haven't been addressed so far, and I don't think they will be addressed. And to me, this just means that restrictions and mandates haven't been really repealed. And as a result, the conclusion is that the convoy didn't really have the impact that we thought it was going to have. On top of that, we're back to talking variants, and the BA2 stealth Omicron advances, and it is in the news. These are just a couple of examples. There's plenty of other articles all over the world talking about the BA2, and it seems to me that it is the next variant that's going to pop up. So not only did this protest not help us move forward with the restrictions, but it's actually opened doors for a lot more surveillance in Canadian society, and a few things are going to come out that are probably not going to be reversible for a while, that are going to cause more limitations on Canadians. I think if folks were really aware what they were up against when it comes to COVID and what's behind COVID, in all honesty, I don't think they would have engaged in this convoy. And as I said in my first video, there's more to the convoy than meets the eye. And I think people should really sit down and think about these possibilities and not be quick in thinking they can reverse this with a protest.
Two possibilities, either 3 doses or lift it. Lift it is probably the right decision right now, not to make it a tokenism, and to have this continuously in our back pocket if it's needed again, perhaps in autumn, one never knows.